Welcome back to the Muse Capital podcast. In this series, we're talking about the future of how we care. We are very excited to welcome to the show Joshua Abram, the co-founder of our latest investment, Conceivable. Conceivable is revolutionizing the IVF space by creating end-to-end automation of the IVF lab process with advanced technology, including robotics and artificial intelligence. IVF today has only ever been a concierge service for the rich, with treatment costing up to $75,000 for a successful outcome. Conceivable shares a core value of ours at Muse Capital, the democratization of care, with their technology drastically reducing costs, improving outcomes, and enabling those who need it to finally be able to access it. IVF is a topic that could not be more relevant in today's news cycles and political climate. Join us for a fascinating conversation about the state of the industry today and what the future holds. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much.
I'd love to jump right into it. So, for people who are unfamiliar with the IVF process, walk us through it, and can you give a brief history on where we are today and how we came to where we are today?
Yeah, well, the history is fascinating. IVF begins in 1978 with the birth of the first baby, Louise Brown. Robert Edwards went on to win the Nobel Prize for this achievement. And it's interesting to note that Edwards was not a doctor. He was a physiologist, and he was a specialist in the lab. And Edwards always thought the lab would rule IVF. And it's the lab that we have focused on at Conceivable as the greatest point of leverage to fixing what's wrong in IVF. And in terms of what's wrong, I mean, here you have a Nobel Prize winning therapy. And the Nobel Committee recognized this as a milestone in modern medicine, something that addressed and has cured, as far as the Nobel Prize Committee was concerned, cured one of the scourges of life, something that we've seen since the Bible. But while the clinical science has improved, the field has utterly failed to scale. And today, 17% of all adults are touched by infertility, essentially unable to conceive without IVF. And yet worldwide, though we have a Nobel Prize-winning cure, 95% of people around the world go untreated. And even in the very rich West, the wealthiest country in the world here in the United States, 80% go untreated. So the challenge before us is to bring this remarkable therapy from the realm of concierge medicine for the rich into a population health-based solution available to all.
Take us back to how IVF actually works. So for people that are new, they've heard IVF, but they don't actually know what happens in the lab, maybe talk us through a couple's experience just going through that, and then we can talk about the cost associated with that.
Sure. So the typical IVF journey begins for most people, I think, in their OBGYN office. I'm having trouble conceiving. I'm worried about it. What can we do? And historically, because OBGYNs knew that in referring their patients out to an REI, a fertility specialist, there was likely to be a trail of tears leading to a $75,000 bill and no guarantee of a child. Historically, OBGYNs have sometimes delayed sending their patients to specialized care. And in the world of fertility, time matters. Every year, as someone gets older, our chance of conceiving goes down. So getting into care early on, as soon as you think there's a problem, is important. So the journey often begins at the OBGYN office. Finally, you get to an REI. And for most people, you're looking at a circa $75,000 bill for a 3-cycle fertility campaign with no guarantee of a child. And the first step in the process is 10 days of hormonal stimulation. These require shots every day, typically administered at home by the patient herself. And can you imagine if you've been diagnosed with another disease, cancer, and the oncologist sent you home and said, here are the drugs, mix them yourself, and get back to us.
That's crazy. It's insane.
But that's what happens in IVF. And then there is a trigger shot to prepare for the next stage, which is the retrieval of eggs from the follicular tubes to a Petri dish. So we are stimulating women to produce, rather than the typical 1 egg per month, to produce 10 to 15 eggs, hopefully. Some people have far fewer eggs. And then to take those eggs and in the laboratory begin the process of IVF, combining sperm and egg to create embryos, which are then incubated for 3 to 5 days. And then typically today, given new advances in IVF, frozen. This has been a radical change in the way that IVF is delivered. It used to be, I think when most of us were growing up, we heard IVF and we thought twins, triplets. The reason for that was IVF pre-vitrification, pre this ability to fast freeze eggs and embryos, was a use it or lose it phenomenon. Now we can freeze eggs, we can then meter them out in embryos one at a time in successive attempts to get pregnant. This has been a huge advance because multiple birth pregnancies are dangerous for both mothers and children. So this has been a terrific step forward. Nationwide, it takes about almost 2.7 attempts for the average patient to become pregnant. And of course, this is highly variable on age. It's worth noting that, women get blamed for everything. And one more example of that exists in IVF. 40% of the time, the patient in an IVF consult is not the woman, it's her partner. And for reasons we don't fully understand, the sperm health and the sperm count of men of our generation is half of what it was for our grandfathers. It's widely thought that it's environmental, but there's no doubt that this is the case. So there is a massive problem with men's own fertility, not discussed enough, and the subject of much of the activity in IVF. And in fact, one of the core techniques of modern IVF, which there's difference of opinion about whether it's necessary in every case, ICSI, the manual injection of sperm into eggs, a process that really began only about a decade ago and is now used almost universally in the United States. But ICSI was originally an important breakthrough because it was the only known cure for male infertility. So that's some of the history of and how we got here of IVF.
I mean, it's extraordinary to think that for the average couple, it could cost up to $75,000. I think one of our core values at Muse Capital is the democratization of care and allowing IVF to become more accessible to those who actually need it. With those numbers, that's certainly not the case today. We saw some recent news, I think last Sunday, that Gavin Newsom signed a bill requiring California insurance providers to cover IVF. It seems there's an understanding that IVF is financially out of reach for a lot of people, but it's not just the money. There's a lot going on with the technology. Is that right?
There's a lot going on with technology, which we can describe in just a second. But while we're on things like the California initiative that you just mentioned, Rachel, it's worth noticing that we are at an absolute, I believe, tipping point in terms of popular support for IVF. Gallup did a poll recently that 84% of Americans support IVF. In this divided country in which we live in, I can't imagine a more unifying issue. It's really rather extraordinary.
It is.
And we see that increasingly there is a movement in the states themselves to offer support for IVF. Massachusetts is probably the leader. And if you work for an employer with more than 50 employees, your health plan is required to have an IVF benefit. And what that does to the utility of IVF is just remarkable. IVF is incredibly price elastic. There was a study by a fertility group related to the WHO that pointed out that for every 1 point decline in the price of IVF, there was a 3.2 percentage increase in the use of IVF. That kind of price elasticity exists in very, very few other parts of the economy. So if we can, through state mandates and through technology such as Conceivable is doing, begin to bring the price down of IVF, we're going to begin hitting true demand. And what is true demand? We mentioned before, 17% of us cannot conceive a child without IVF. In countries, many of them today small, wonderful, eccentric, with reasons of their own to support IVF, but not really scalable, but kind of a perfect economic experiment. Countries like Denmark, where 10% of all kids today are IVF kids, or Belgium, where 8.6% today of all kids are IVF kids. They've just thrown money at this, and they've done something that's not scalable, wonderful, but not scalable. But what they have demonstrated is that when you reduce the cost of IVF, and critically, you bring IVF care closer to the patient by using a broader network of competent clinicians to deliver care, utility soars. In Massachusetts today, 7% of all kids are IVF kids, whereas nationwide, incorporating the most of the country that has no such mandate, in America today, only about 2% of all births are IVF children. So we have a long way to go, but we know what needs to be done. We need to reduce the cost, and we need to begin addressing some of these enormous fertility deserts that exist in America. Today, 40% of Americans live more than a day's drive away from a fertility center, making it practically impossible to undergo IVF for the normal person. And today, it requires, in the United States, about 160 hours for the average patient to undergo IVF. That's just not possible for most people with duties of their job and their family and just frankly exhaustion. So we need to address price. We need to address bringing care closer to the patient. And we can do both of those through technology.
And just one point, just back to the market. And you say 17% today. This is only getting worse, right? This is the market is only getting bigger. I think that translates to 1 in 6 couples needing IVF treatment.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And just because of what's happening today, women having children older, lifestyle changes, environmental changes, they're affecting sperm health. This is only a growing market, correct?
Absolutely. It's a growing market for fertility, but bear in mind that once we get the price of IVF down, and Conceivable, with our clinical partners, sees a very clear path to taking the price down from circa $75,000 with no guarantee of a child to $15,000, no baby, no fee. A huge swing, and making IVF, one, accessible to most people, particularly if we, with partners, can provide a financing plan, and such financing plans exist today, to make this within the realm of I hate to say it this way, but another consumer purchase that all of us can imagine. How many of us can really imagine $75,000? But I think most of us can imagine a $15,000 payment that we finance over time.
In fact, Muse Capital is an investor in a financing platform called Future Family.
I think they're the leading fertility financing platform in the US today.
Are you familiar?
We are familiar with them. We would love to be in touch.
We can make that happen.
Muse Capital, Muse Capital, business development, strategic value, right? In
action.
In action.
Thank you, my friends. There we go. But the other key market driver here is going to be, once we get the price down, IVF can be used for many critical populations. As an example, 2% of all women today suffer from recurrent miscarriage. IVF is the answer to that, but today it's too expensive. There's a whole host of monogenic diseases. We're not talking here about designer babies. We're talking about ending a devastating history of BRCA in your family, or ending a history of sickle cell anemia in your family. That can be done with great efficiency through IVF, but today it's just too expensive to do it. And then we have the LGBTQ community. Barclays Bank, in a study of IVF, had a remarkable observation recently, and that is that 52% of gay Americans under the age of 35 say they wish to have a family. And when you begin to think about that, if the price of IVF were something other than what it is today, if it were affordable, these populations could take the numbers from the demand for fertility itself services, which is probably 12 million babies wishing to be born a year for fertility alone, to 2 or 3x that, helping to serve other populations.
Wow. So
let's talk about Conceivable a little bit. All right.
yes, let's talk
Yeah.
about what you're doing with Conceivable to change this.
Yeah. Against that backdrop, Conceivable is actually our second IVF automation company. The first, which my co-founder Alan Murray and I established, thrives today. It's called Tomorrow Life Sciences. And it developed the only FDA-approved solution for the management of the frozen eggs and embryos that are the core of IVF. We've talked about that. But in the course of creating Tomorrow, we realized that to get to that kind of democratization represented by $15,000, no baby, no fee, we have to rethink the lab on an end-to-end basis. And I have nothing but admiration for the embryologists who work in them. But today's labs, I think by anyone's admission, are manual, artisanal, and largely analog. There are hundreds of manual steps, hundreds, each of which has to go right in order to coax sperm and egg into an embryo. In many ways, the IVF lab is a human pipetting operation. What we've done at Conceivable is taken everything that happens in the IVF lab and drawing from the best of cell automation, cell manufacturing, the billions that have been spent in that field and other adjacent fields that inform what we're doing. We have rethought IVF as a modern cell therapy, as modern cell manufacturing. And we have developed an end-to-end automated lab that is fully automated. We keep, by choice, people in the loop and skilled embryologists in the loop, but it's fully automated. And every step of the IVF process, from the AI-aided selection of sperm to the preparation of eggs to the magic moment of insemination, through incubation and vitrification, every single one of those steps is automated. And to give you a sense of the kind of, first, the economic efficiency and then the clinical efficiency that can be achieved through this, we can reduce the number of staff required to run a 2,000 cycle a year IVF lab from circa 25 or 30 highly paid, difficult to attract and retained, many of them PhDs, embryologist technicians, to 3, a senior embryologist, a engineer, and a lab technician. And, I say this, and the important point to ask next, well, how good is it? In our early testing, we are producing results that would be the envy of any IVF lab in the world. And these are early results. The numbers are still small, but frankly, they're only going to get better. We've been very grateful and delighted to have 20 pregnancies through an IRB study that we undertook. Our pregnancy rates are about 50% through automation.
How does that compare to the success rates without automation? So what are the rates of success per round?
In our early IRB study, we are seeing an overall success rate of just under 50%, 49% and a little change. The average IVF center in the United States would be happy with a 40% rate. So just out of the box, we are doing really well, and it's only going to get better from here. We've seen improvements at every step of the process that we have automated. We see improvements in something as mundane as the preparation of dishes. We see a lift in the selection of sperm. One of the major clinics who has used our technology for sperm selection is going to report at the American Society of Reproductive Medicine in a few days that they see a 10% improvement in blastocyst formation, embryo formation, from the use of our sperm selection. We know that our method of ICSI, the insemination process, using something called a piezo drill to achieve this, in Asia has reported 20% improvement, particularly in the cases involving older women whose eggs are brittle and more vulnerable to pancaking when the traditional ICSI needle is used rather than piezo technology. So at every step of the way, we are seeing improvements which are finally reflected in the success rates that we've had in the IRB, which would be the envy of any lab in the world.
And they will keep getting better because they'll get smarter on their data and just get smarter and smarter, so that speed of improvement's only going to get exponential.
100%.
And then what's fascinating is that both the clinic wants to increase their success rate. They want to market themselves as we have extraordinary success rates with our births, so they can attract more patients. And of course, the patients want to be able to do it in not 2.7 attempts, but one attempt potentially, eventually.
So why don't we talk about scaling? Today, if you think about the average IVF clinic and how many cycles they're able to do versus what a technology like this could achieve, maybe you could talk to that.
We know that the true demand for IVF, for infertility alone, is on the order of 12 million children a year worldwide. Today, we are seeing less than 1 million. And we know beyond that, there are many other use cases for IVF. So we've got to be looking for a 5, 6, 7, 8xing of the scale of IVF, and it simply cannot be done in today's existing labs. We need to make this into a modern cell therapy. We need to do it with automation. Each lab that we at Conceivable offer can do 2,000 cases a year. In the context of American IVF centers, that makes it one of the larger labs, a top 10 or 15 lab. But the other thing we need to do is we need to involve different types of clinicians in the process. We began talking today about the critical role of OBGYNs in the delivery of care. And in America, they've been largely frozen out of the process. And all IVF runs through reproductive endocrinologists, of which there are only 1,300 to treat 18% of the population afflicted with infertility. And only 33 new fellows are admitted a year. By contrast, in the United States, there are 35,000 OBGYNs.
Fascinating. So why hasn't this technology existed in the past, and what sets Conceivable apart from anyone else potentially looking at solving this issue?
You know, there's a great visionary in this field. Stuart Kaufman is a biologist, MD, MacArthur Grant winner associated with Stanford. And Kaufman writes about something called the adjacent possible. And the adjacent possible means that, or references the fact that while an enormous range of innovation is possible at any given moment, the predicates must exist for that innovation. So as an example that we're all familiar with, we could not have had the ride-sharing economy without phones that were, mobile phones that were equipped with GPS, and without the Apple App Store, frankly. At Conceivable, we are using technology from diverse fields to affect a whole new level of change. And this technology simply didn't exist 3-4 years ago. Let me give you an example. There have been massive advances because of the billions of dollars spent in cell therapy and cell manufacturing. We are bringing those techniques to IVF, and those are very, very recent. There are only 12 approved cell therapies or so in the US market. So that's very recent. We are also drawing from further afield. The technology that we are using to drive our automated pipettes, replacing these hundreds of manual steps with precise robots, are using technology that was originally developed for autonomous driving. And the same technology that we hope will allow cars to direct appropriately may not be ready for prime time in that category, but they are certainly proficient for driving pipettes. And the other example of that is in robotics. We are using robotics that have a precision that is just unimaginable when compared to the human hand, able genuinely to operate with skill at the microscopic level. And these robots come largely from the world of chip manufacturing. And the investment in this and the progress in chip manufacturing over the even past 5 years has made possible feats of precision that would have been beyond our reach just 5 years ago. So we are leaning very heavily on technology that comes from outside of IVF. And we are leaning on the adjacent possible to affect change that I don't think anyone imagined would be here this fast.
So I'm curious with all these new technologies versus what exists today, how does Conceivable fit into the regulatory side, and work with the FDA?
So our business model is lab as a service. We will own and operate our labs and generally offer the service on-prem in concert with our customers, be they legacy IVF clinics or be they regional hospitals, which have shown a lot of interest in getting involved in IVF. We will not be selling equipment. So that puts us in a slightly different regulatory regime, which allows us to come to market much more quickly. And our regulator in IVF is not so much the FDA as it is CAP, the College of American Pathology. The FDA historically has been concerned with IVF as it relates to the management of donor gametes and the integrity of their management and infectious diseases. CAP has been tasked with regulating what happens within the lab and the protocols being used within the lab. And we have begun discussions with figures in CAP. I think we're going to be very enthusiastically received. I think CAP is open to the kind of automation that we are envisioning, and we look forward to working with them to bring it to market.
And given the very hot topic of fertility and IVF in the upcoming election, how does a technology like Conceivable address, I guess, the concerns of both sides?
Well, first of all, who would have thought a couple of years ago that we would be at this point that you can't run for higher office in America without having a lived experience in IVF? And who would have thought that it would include such a diverse range of figures as Michelle Obama and, of course, Vice Presidential candidate Waltz, and then Mike Pence? This really is a bipartisan issue. One of the ways that Conceivable is going to manage risk, but I think also going to provide comfort to people on all sides, particularly the right of the political spectrum, is that we will eventually be producing one embryo at a time. Today, using the manual system, it's only practicable and manageable to produce embryos in batches. And of course, this raises the question at the end of the day, what do we do with the unused embryos? People have different views on this, and we need to respect them all. By producing one embryo at a time, we de-risk the whole process for the patient, because if there were some catastrophe in a existing lab and all the patient's collection of embryos or eggs was exposed at the same time, that would be a disaster. We will be able to meter them out one at a time, produce them one at a time. And then it also means at the end of the day that we don't have the question, which many on the right are concerned about, what to do with embryos that are not used. And so that issue goes away. So as we've begun to speak with leaders in Congress, and we have, this is enormously attractive on both sides of the aisle. And I think it will be an important part of Conceivable's value for a variety of reasons.
No, it's incredible. And from a societal perspective, cultural perspective, the shift is immense. From a business perspective, how big can this get?
Well, I think we're going to go from a population of 500,000 children being born worldwide through IVF to a world in which, just for fertility alone, we will be approaching 12 million, and then add on the other use cases for IVF, whether for the LGBTQ community or whether for prevention of serious monogenetic diseases. This can be a business that is 15, 20x what we see today over the expanded period of time. But in terms of Conceivable, let's step back for a minute and just think about how we earn our living and what the implications of that in terms of scale are. Conceivable charges our clients something in the order of $3,000 per cycle, which is less than leading labs spend to do this work themselves. They probably spend about $4,200 to $4,500 a cycle. So we are less expensive, and we have every reason to believe that we will be clinically superior. But looking ahead, with no massive growth over the present rate of ascendancy in IVF, they're projected to be 6.5 million cycles, IVF cycles worldwide in 10 years, in 2034. And that's a $19 billion market. If you take those 6.5 million cycles and apply Conceivable's $3,000 fee, a $19 billion opportunity. And if we were to capture it Conceivable through superior results, lower costs, the ability to scale, just 5% of that market of 6.5 million cycles, we would have annual revenues of about $975 million. So there's a big opportunity here in fertility writ large and fertility automation. And we think the pace of this development is just about to take off in a way that no one could have anticipated.
Talk about good timing.
Sometimes you get lucky, don't we? And we can't control timing. But this one, I think that we all, you and the establishment of your fund, what we're focused on at Conceivable, I think we just hit history in one of those hinge moments. And it's never easy to do big things, but it's a lot easier when you have history at your back rather than as a headwind.
Mm-hmm. It is a perfect timing, perfect storm.
You know, one of the interesting things is that IVF used to be a secret, and now it's the token of one's humanity.
We love that. And I think on that note, it's an extremely positive thing that these typical kind of taboo areas of women's health, like menopause, fertility, this was all very private and you don't talk about it in public. The fact that this is now becoming accepted in the US and globally is a really exciting time, I think, for all of us, and only beneficial for everyone. Just kind of sick of women, particularly, suffering in silence. And I think these movements are only positive and only going to get better. So thank you, Josh, and the team for what you're doing. And we are very excited to support you on the journey and for the future.
Very proud.
And thank you for that. We are so glad to have you as our partner.
Thank you so much for listening. For additional information, check out our show notes, and to find out more about Conceivable, go to conceivable.life. As always, you can find out more about us at musecapital.vc. Special thanks to our executive producer, Lauren Maddock, and our engineer and composer, John Meek. Ciao for now.